In 2020, companies made widespread diversity commitments. Will they last? Today on Culture Builder Live. Hey, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technically, the news organization with a community of technology professionals. We have had years of conversations around diversifying tech workforces. That moment was heightened in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, and we saw more widespread commitments on diversifying a workforce than ever before. A natural and worthy question has become, will that last? Will companies make the change they hope to see? Can they? And if so, how? To talk about this, I'm joined by Kristin and Mercedes Ballard of Heristic. We're going to hear from them. They're experts in this and many other matters. Kristin and Mercedes, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Excited to have you. So let's perhaps start with a temperature check on your mood. Are when you look at the diversifying workforce commitments of the last few years, are you hopeful that they're making change, that they will do the work that they're aiming to do?
Well, you'll never get the optimist out of us. That is something that is eternal in our workforce. And I would say that there's a lot of work yet to be done, absolutely. But the victory is in the tone of this conversation. We are never going back to discussing diversity and inclusion topics the way we did prior to George Floyd in the workplace. And that's something to be really optimistic about.
I could not agree more. I am also an equal optimist as Kristin is here. I think that the landscape has changed. What we as job seekers and job providers expect out of what it means to be a part of corporate America and how to participate, that's evolving. And I don't see a situation where things go back to where they were.
I saw a survey of 1,000 or so HR pros. Side note, we all know it's one of the most challenging professions in organization over the last couple of years. It always was, but we've seen burnout and turnover and open roles in HR grow in the last 6 months even. That points to a very real trend of burnout, particularly among HR professionals. And so no surprise, there's a lot on that plate. So I was alarmed, intrigued, concerned, a lot of feelings when I saw this survey of 1,000 or so HR pros that annually ranks priorities, and diversifying workforce, DEI commitments were 1 or 2 the last couple of years, and the latest survey showed that had sunk a bit. I think it was 3 or 4 in average priority. There's a lot happening here, issues of retention and staff burnout, health concerns for a lot of employers, they all shot up. But I'm kind of curious your take. Is that just, should that be a warning sign that we could lose momentum that we built up in 2020? Is this just the inevitable part of this becoming a framework for all conversations? When you hear numbers like that, does that shake any of the optimism you guys so confidently hold?
So personally, it doesn't shake me, not by any stretch of the imagination. I think that you hit a good point that like the data doesn't always show the full picture. I would be curious to know, like, what are the new problems that are arising for these HR leaders to have them deprioritize DEI. For instance, maybe it's now that they have like an established DEI strategy, they need to focus more so on figuring out like, how do we manage compensation in this remote first world that we're experiencing? So I really think that it's like more of a shift in conflicting priorities rather than a deprioritization of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think DEI as a priority, as a strategy, as a framework within organizations is not going to go anywhere. And just like how we I'm not sure on this list if they included like learning and development, right? That is just such an innate part of most organizations at this game in the stage, or at this stage in the game, excuse me, that it probably isn't ranked as high. So it's just where we are in the ebbs and flows, but I don't think it's going anywhere. And that number, even if it's, down a couple percentage points, doesn't necessarily like shake my resolve in what we're doing.
Yeah, to add to that, there has been like thousands of new like DEI leadership positions created inside of organizations. And I would probably argue that a lot of that responsibility for focusing on inclusion programming inside of companies is falling to those roles rather than the HR leader now. They're taking a little bit of that off their plate. And, Mercedes and I know, working in HR most of our careers, that role is extremely reactive, and the world is in a giant like toss everything up in the air and see where it lands when it comes to like workplaces. And amidst this great resignation, I think other things are taking like people's attention away, but the programming that was laid in place last year will remain.
Yeah, and I will add, I saw a recent study that also gives me hope that 79% of organizations that were surveyed, believe it was by World Business Research, in collaboration with the training organization, but they're saying that 79% of organizations are allocating more budget to DEI resources in 2022. So I would argue that those are the type of metrics that I care more about, more so of whether or not it's a priority. Like what finances are we backing up? How much executive leadership and sponsorship do we have involved? How are these programs evolving to include more of the underrepresented and underserved groups that may have not been a part of that conversation? And one of the other things that we also talk about too is like this lens of DEI. Right now, we get very focused on like women in tech, or, Black and Hispanics in entrepreneurship, or what have you. But there are so many other populations that like we're just now starting to talk about and bringing, like offering a seat at the table, such as formerly incarcerated folks, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to see how this table is expanding as the conversations are progressing.
Yeah, that is well said. I'll note that I've done in a series of interviews. There is an inherent and important tension between the widest definitions of diversity, and if out of Central Core we want to talk about central wealth gap or income gap between Black and Brown residents, and that is one reason why in one of the fastest growing segments of our economy, technology, it's why we care so much about Black and Brown professionals in particular. And I only add that because I think we should talk as a group of people aiming to lead and grow technology professionals, that there is a tension there. We have to talk about that. We both want to diversify what diversity means, but not lose sight of one of the core sins of our work that we are still duplicating, particularly among Black professionals. And let's not lose sight of that as one gap. Is that something you guys experienced, that balancing that? Can we hold those two truths at the same time, that we need to both diversify the word without losing sight of some of those foundational building blocks of this work?
I think so. I would absolutely agree. I think that's where you grow, is where you like sit in dissonance for a while and figure out where you land on it. I would say that like when you talk about diversity to folks who are unfamiliar with it, they will probably jump to racial diversity first. And that's because it's the most glaring problem when you look around a tech office and you see not one single Black person there, or maybe one, right? So we will always focus on that primarily. It's a very, very obvious problem to solve. However, there's many other types of diversity that we'd also like to focus on. LGBTQ plus. We'd like to focus on caretaker, parent, elderly care type of diversity that affects how you interact in the workplace. There's a myriad of other examples of kind of invisible diversity that all of that requires empathy. And we want to build programming, like Mercedes says about Heristic all the time, a workplace for all, every individual, no matter where they come from.
Well said. All right, now let's touch on, at this stage, when this conversation is perhaps maturing. We were years into a more prominent conversation around tech employers. 2020 and the murder of George Floyd further accelerated focus the attention of millions, what should goals look like in 2022 and beyond? What kinds of goals should employers be thinking about, keeping in mind the diversity of diversity and not losing the focus of what 2020 was largely focused on?
You want to take that, Mercedes?
Sure. So I think it's important to think of it more of a journey, right? We talked about how the goals that we're striving for, they're ever evolving. What it means for diversity, as we just mentioned, that is an evolving definition, right? So the goals for it are going to be evolving. What does it mean? Like, what number are you, I guess, striving for when you're talking about like inclusion, right? Like, of course, you want 100% of your organization to feel included and feel belong, like they belong within the organization. But it's like, it's beyond that. We're like, okay, now that everybody feels included, how do we like make sure that everybody is able to like have all the resources that they are, and so on and so forth. And so I think we can think of this as like, it's a journey that we're navigating, and there's never going to be an endpoint. The thing that we strive towards is just like, are you better than like who you were or who the organization was a year ago, 2 years ago? It's really a benchmark against yourself, and just like making sure that you are moving forward along, for lack of better words, an enlightened path.
Just quick, a follow up on that. A common diversity goal: I want my workforce to look like my community. Is it like a very approachable, straightforward goal that you can? There's a degree of number setting you can do around that. This is maybe somewhat of a small point, but it's showing up sometimes in our reporting. For a while there, this was, we'd say to companies in cities we report in and say, should you look like the city you are in? And then a bunch of them went remote, and that logic broke a little bit. And so then we're like, well, would the casual challenge be you should look like the country, but maybe you have international staff too? I guess I just wonder, have you guys, this is a very tactical point, but it does speak to like what I think conversations are having. Have you changed your recommendations on what it means to, I've had a company say like, my users are very white. So like, you probably don't want me to look like my user base. I wonder what are you seeing in terms of goals, and has that shifted much in the last 2 years about how you would guide for even like benchmarks on at least the diverse workforce side?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would lean into the data on that. The case for DEI is obvious and strong. There have been like 200 plus studies that show that inclusive workplaces are more creative, more durable, have better financial performance, et cetera, et cetera. So if someone pushes back in that way, it's like, do you like revenue, profits, innovation? If so, this is still a great idea. And to the point around like remote workforce, should we shift to national numbers? Like, you could argue that we have some, exclusionary problems in our society rather than just our workforce. One thing I think is really interesting is that most people in the United States only experience diversity at work because their communities are so isolated naturally. Suburban, city grids, etc. You only interact with people who are pretty similar to you at church, in your bowling league, your t-ball league, whatever it is. And the workplace is exactly the place to focus on these efforts and have this conversation, because it's the most opportunity to do so in the most decent manner. You can't be an asshole at work without some consequences, right? So I would push back hard on that DEI is a business case that makes a lot of sense. And I wouldn't sit comfortably on your small, remote, user-based community, because it's not the right financial move in the long run.
Well said. Mercedes, well, so let's go to folks who may feel stalled. Let's say I did set a new wave of goals, and maybe I reached some, or I hit new walls, or there's just, I took on too much as an employer, and man, I am bleary-eyed in the face of the many challenges I'm facing right now. What's your advice when you first talk to that employer that is, or HR pro, or or someone else in leadership who's feeling stalled out in their DEI goals, general diversity workforce goals? How do you jumpstart some attention for someone who's feeling stalled?
Go ahead, Kristin.
Oh, sure. So I would say that, first of all, I empathize with that role because most of your HR leaders in 2020 had a brand new job on their plate that they had never considered, and they were already overworked. So everyone was doing an entire DEI leadership role on top of their HR leader role. And that is a tremendous amount of work, and it requires very well thought out strategy and intentions, and it's very sensitive. So it's a big job. So I empathy first for that reaction to feeling bleary-eyed and stalled. But here's some things I would recommend quickly is having alignment to your leadership and setting a tone at the top for the guidance here will ease that journey moving forward. If your leadership isn't responsive to that, then I would push from the bottom to encourage them to speak on it. But if you have their buy-in, use it and use it to push your work forward. Enforce and evolve your culture in this direction, because it's going to take a lot of like open communication where you clearly explain the organizational purpose around the goals that are going to shift as a result of including this inclusional programming. Listen to your diversity groups internally and externally. Start measuring everything. Heristic's approach is always like face it, measure it, and then build. We need to listen and address like the actual status quo of things before you start making big changes, and that will really help you if you're data driven and use metrics to show your growth over time. That'll reinforce anything you pull back to leadership as well. They want to see data driven results. And then you're going to talk to your external DEI influences if you can. Heristic is a great place to give you some pointers and guidance, but you want to reimagine your workforce, the programs, the infrastructure, the pay equity, all of those things to push all of these things in an operational infrastructure piece in conjunction with the leadership mandate from above.
And I have one other thing I would add to it is always find community. One of the things that we do with the HR leaders that we work with is we created this brain trust where individuals can come together. Most of our HR leaders are either sole HR teams working at growth stage startups, or maybe it's like them and one other person. And so we allow like for a space where people to come in, talk about like what are the biggest challenges that they're facing, and then as like a group, the Mind Hive gets together to like brainstorm solutions and create innovative like approaches to solving whatever problems that it is that they're experiencing. So I would say like find your community. When you feel burnt out, or when you feel like you're not going too far, you're reaching that hurdle, that roadblock, reach out to your community, because like we as HR leaders, we are all going through it right now, and it's better to have somebody to go through it with than just like stay isolated and be frustrated in the silo that is your organization.
Well said. I think that is a fine way to end it. Kristin and Mercedes from Heristic, please contact them for additional support. Thank you guys so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
One of my favorite takeaways here is equity is a direction, not a destination, a theme that we've had in past conversations. Let's keep that in mind. Thanks all. This is this week's Culture Builder Live. As always, you can find a full recap on Technically. We'll include some links below the video to Heristic and others. We'll talk to you soon. See you next week. Bye.